Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, voters in the UK are expected to return the Labour Party to power after 14 years.
There's a lot of distrust in the Conservative politicians, and I think they're going to look forward to a break from the chaos that the Tories have brought them.
So while the right makes gains in other parts of Europe, why are they losing in the UK? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Millions of people are casting their vote today in the UK general election. They'll be electing their local member of parliament and helping choose the next government. Conservative Prime Minister Rishi Sunak took people by surprise when he called for the election in May.
Rishi Sunak, Britain's beleaguered Conservative Prime Minister, took a gamble, calling an election several months earlier than expected.
But polls are suggesting that his party will not achieve victory. Anealla Safdar is Europe editor for AlJazeera.com, and she's been covering the election from outside London. So Anealla, 2024 is the year of the election, with so many voters around the world heading to the polls. And one challenge we sometimes have with elections is how to make the coverage exciting. So in the UK, the Labour candidate is already accused of boring people half to death with literal headlines talking about the fact that he is not that exciting of a candidate.
He's boring, he's not hard-hitting, he doesn't show strength.
With that in mind, what is at stake here?
So I think people want the outcome of the election to work for them. Now, we've had 14 years of the Conservatives. All the economic indicators, except from unemployment, are down. Inflation is at a record. Young people are struggling to get homes. The NHS queues are kind of at record levels, so that's for hospital appointments. So it affects loads of people really seriously. Your day-to-day life is all to do with how the government kind of leads all of these different affairs.
Since World War II, voters in every election have gone to the polls feeling their living standards are improving. This year is an exception. Disposable incomes are falling in what has been the worst period for living standards in modern history.
So if you stop anyone on any British street, they will kind of talk of a Britain that's not the same as before, and all of these services have been wrecked by 14 years of Tory austerity.
We're poor. We've become the third world country now. We was a first world country. But you look at the price of this tin of ackee, for example, £4.69. You know, we used to get things like this for £2.
So for a lot of people, there's a sense of hope. There's a sense of change for the sake of change. The opposition party, which is Labour, soon to become, as polls, predict, the leading party in government. Keir Starmer is not very, very exciting, but he is different. He's different to a lot of the Conservative leaders that we've had in the past 14 years. He's a former human rights lawyer. He's a centrist. He's bringing the party to the centre. And for a lot of Britons, anything at the moment is better than the Conservatives because they've been racked by loads of scandals, as well as this poor economic performance.
Anything is better than the Conservatives, also known as the Tories. Okay, so let's talk about how this all came to be. The announcement of elections was a massive shock.
Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future. Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
Briefly get us up to speed. Why did the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, suddenly call for snap elections? And why did he do it in such a dramatic way, stepping out onto the podium in the pouring rain? What happened there?
So in Sunak's defense, he couldn't control whether it was raining or not, right? He had made a plan that day, and it just rains whenever it wants in England. As you know, you can always guarantee one thing, that it's going to rain. He needed to call an election by December of this year. And so pro-conservative voices and some analysts would say that there was some economic data that pointed to a recovery. And so he would kind of capitalize on this and say, now the things are getting better, it's time for an election. You know, by law, he had to call one anyway before the end of this year. So it had to happen at some point. His critics would say there's no way the economic situation was going to get any better. And so it's kind of leveled. And so let's just call it now while we still have a chance at winning an election. And so the Tories had to just take what they could get, call an election. You know, that's part of the democratic process. He isn't particularly popular. And you have to hand it back to the people at some point.
So keeping that unpopularity in mind, it's different from what we're seeing in the rest of Europe. In France and the European Parliament, the right is winning big. And that's different from what's predicted to happen in the UK elections. Why is it different? What's happening in the UK?
So the French far right was founded by the father of Marine Le Pen in the early 1970s. So they've been doing the groundwork for a long time to build up to this. Here, we just have two main parties. There's just the Conservatives or Labour. You know, those two parties regularly just hand power over every few years. And the far right hasn't been a credible threat. You know, it's always come up in kind of the British National Party at some point, which was just so outwardly racist and offensive that you wouldn't feel like you could walk down the street and say, I'm voting for the BNP without being looked down on, you know, it was so nasty. Now we have this other party called Reform, which is being led by Nigel Farage, who's really articulate. You know, he knows how to drum up a crowd, knows how to talk.
Come on, guys, politics can be exciting. You know why? Because I'm back. I'm leading Reform UK. I'm standing for Parliament. I believe in the country. I want us to have fun, be successful. Join me.
He's a big character in this year's general election, especially when you have Labour's Keir Starmer and the Tories' Rishi Sunak, who are quite boring. And so here comes Nigel Farage, who talks about all kinds of emotive things. You know, people are coming over on the boats to create danger, create dangerous situations. You know, I spoke to some of his voters in Clacton, which is where he's finally going to become an MP, it looks like, on his 8th attempt. And they have a real fear of undocumented migrants. And there's no undocumented migrants in Clacton at all, you know.
This small town, Clacton-on-Sea.
Yeah. He's managed to create a conspiracy of fear, I think, for a lot of Britons and blame migration for a lot of Britain's woes. So the number one concern for Reform voters is migration. They talk of a bygone Britain where everybody had respect for each other and, you know, there were these traditional values. And I tried to press them on what exactly that means.
We live in a woke country, and it ain't the world that we grew up in. We grew up in the East End of London, right, and we done what was right. You had strict values and morals, which we lived by them, like, yeah?
I was there from, 9 a.m. till about 6 p.m. Every single person I stopped was either voting Reform, the majority, I think one or two had yet to decide. One woman said she was going to vote for Reform and her friends turned around to her and said, "You're not, are you?" And she said, "Oh, no, I'm voting for Conservative."
So a little mini public shaming that may have caused her to change her answer.
Yes.
But of course, that's the thing. Polls are suggesting one thing, polls have been wrong before, and people are not always honest about who they're going to vote for.
Yeah.
So what did you make of that encounter?
I mean, I made of it that she was in the extreme minority and whatever happens, Reform will win. You know, she'll probably go and vote for Reform, and so will many others who don't actually say who they're going to vote for.
After the break, the challenges Britain's Labour Party faces after 14 years out of power. So, Anealla, tell me about the Labour Party. The last time they were in office was 2010, when Gordon Brown was prime minister. Why have they been absent from 10 Downing Street for so long?
I think it's less to do with why Labour hasn't managed to get in and why the Tories have managed to stay, right? Going back to these crises that they've somehow handled. But the reason Labour haven't managed to outperform the Tories in the last 14 years is because they haven't had a convincing leader. Ed Miliband was the leader for a while, and then they had this kind of leadership crisis with Jeremy Corbyn, and then Keir Starmer, was the next leader, promising to take Labour down a new route, completely different to Corbyn.
Wow. So, who is Keir Starmer?
This election is a big choice about the future of the country. Do you want 5 more years of what we've had for the past 14? Or do you believe it's time for change?
He's been the center of jokes regarding the lack of his charisma, his personality.
Keir Starmer he's not just particularly uncharacteristic. He is someone with no personality and no policies.
He's seen as a bit of a wooden character, not able to communicate that clearly.
Fun fact about Keir, there aren't any. In fact, when pollsters asked voters to describe what Starmer stands for, the responses included nothing, not sure, and don't know. His most notable attribute may be having no real notable attribute at all, as this pollster...
What should we know about him?
I think it's interesting that we've only started to see in the worldwide press profiles about him in the last few weeks of the election. It's not like he's the kind of character you're desperate to unpack like Nigel Farage, right? Because he doesn't have extreme politics. He doesn't have anything of note to talk about. Rishi Sunak is one of the world's richest men. So that's an interesting thing to look at. Keir Starmer is pretty kind of middle of the road. He's in his early 60s now. He was born in London to fairly, middle-class parents. He seems kind of mild-mannered. He's a centrist. He's progressive. And his job now is to lead the party, convince Britons that the Labour Party is as one, which he's already had a kind of rocky road with in this election. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if he's able to hold it together.
But he's already lost some Labour voters. Tell me about Tim Flynn. You met him at a protest.
Yeah. Tim Flynn is one of the voters I've met who's voted for Labour all his life, and he worked as an NHS psychotherapist for many, many years. He's retired.
I cannot vote Labour, so I'm voting Green. Now, there's virtually no difference between Tory and Labour, and particularly because of Keir Starmer's comments over Palestine, I just could not vote Labour.
Imagine voting for one party all your life. Something big has to be the reason for you not to do so. And for many former Labour voters, it's the war in Gaza. And it's Keir Starmer's stance on the war in Gaza.
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the sort of core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself and Hamas bears responsibility.
So Starmer's come out in support for Israel really hard, right? Even up to the point of, I think, last week or the week before, he was having an interview on LBC, which is a radio station here, and said that Israel has the right to self-defense. He has not called for an immediate ceasefire, which is the same as the Conservatives. 2 other parties have, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. But most former Labour pro-Palestinian voters I spoke to are voting for the Greens, or they're voting for an independent candidate who's running on a pro-Palestine ticket.
So, Anealla, as Al Jazeera's Europe editor, what do you predict your Friday is going to look like come exit polling from the election?
I think Britain is headed for a Labour majority in government. I think Keir Starmer will be the Prime Minister. I don't think there will be a huge level of excitement about that. I think there'll be some quiet hope for the people that voted for him. And sadly, I think a lot of Britons feel very disconnected, disenfranchised, and disillusioned with the political system, that for them it's just another Friday waking up and it doesn't make a difference.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by David Enders, Ashish Malhotra, Duha Mosaad, and Marcos Bartolome, with Amy Walters, Chloe K. Lee, Manahil Naveed, Veronique Eshaya, Mohammed Zain Shafi Khan, and me, Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Wazwaz. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.